Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richmond, the vice president of the foundation. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show, as you know, that brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. Sheldon, I thought we'd talk about this debate that I participated in Phoenix, at least the substance of the debate. It turned out to be one of the greatest debates I've ever participated in. It just took place this last Saturday night, and it was sponsored by a group called the Freedom Library that is run by a gentleman named Howard Blitz out in Yuma, Arizona. And this little organization is one of the most fantastic libertarian educational foundations in the country. Howard has done fantastic work over the years, especially with young people. He teaches classes on free market principles, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. I attended one class when I was there in Yuma, and he had like 15 people there. It's a 2-month class that he teaches, and they're all there just because they want to learn about these principles, young people, older people. It's just a fantastic organization, and he puts on about 3 big events a year. And one of the events this year is this gigantic debate. There were 500 people in this great big school auditorium, and the 3 debaters were Dinesh D'Souza, a conservative, the guy that's come out with this film America, and there was a liberal named Andre Cherny, who is a graduate of Harvard, became a lawyer. He's published 2 books. I think he was head of the Democratic Party for a while in Arizona. He was a prosecutor for a while. Now he's working for a hedge fund. So brilliant guy and dyed-in-the-wool leftist progressive. And then me, the libertarian. And what Howard wanted to do is, bring as many people together in the audience to hear what the differences are between libertarians, conservatives, and liberals, so that people could finally get a handle on it. And as you know, sometimes people think that libertarianism is like a branch of conservatism. And as I point out to the audience, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, I didn't say this during the debate, but as far as I'm concerned, there's not really much difference between liberals and conservatives, and that became highlighted as this debate went on. I mean, there was some commonality of beliefs between D'Souza and me on economics, but mostly it was there was a real distinction, and the gloves came off, but it was a high-quality debate. No personal attacks, in other words, and so forth. And they filmed it, and they're going to put it online. And when we get it online, we'll share it in our FFF Daily. And, I invite anybody to look at it and, refer their friends to it, because it was a fantastic exposition on libertarianism, conservatism, and progressivism. So the moderator asked us each 5 questions of what is the role of government for the future of America, in terms of a free society and prosperity and so forth. And so I thought we would look at those 5 areas in this half hour and kind of give the libertarian perspective, and I give a little bit about what the conservative and liberal said. But I thought this would be an interesting half hour for you and I to discuss these things. And I know that your perspective is that there should be no role for government in anything. But I thought by focusing in on these areas, we'd be able to elucidate a little bit of libertarian principles and how they apply to the real world issues. So the first one was education. So we were asked, okay, what's your position on education? And I know you've done this great book called Separating School and State. So let me throw the ball at you and say, what do you think about the role of the state in education?
Well, I think I can anticipate what it is you said that evening, namely that the government should have no role in education whatsoever, either providing it or paying for it. Both sides. Sometimes conservatives don't think government should provide the education. They don't seem to object to government paying for it, the taxpayers paying for it, of course. And so they support vouchers or various other schemes, which introduces, some modicum of choice, but the funding is still left up to, legislatures and governors or mayors or whoever, or even the president of the United States in some cases. So you and I would both say there are no grounds whatsoever for government to be involved in education. Governments, of course, are bureaucratic, and therefore they're grossly inefficient, And to be more specific about why that's the case, it's because a bureaucracy, a government bureaucracy, doesn't face a market test. It doesn't get its revenues by attracting and pleasing consumers. In this case, it would be parents paying for their kids' education. So it doesn't get its money by persuasion or by consent. It gets it through force, taxation. And its product doesn't face the market test because lots of people will use the government schools if for no other reason that they appear to be free. And then in one sense, they're free. Of course, they're paying through taxes, whether they're a homeowner or a renter who's paying school taxes through the rent, or in some places schools are financed by other forms of taxation. So people are paying taxes, but then when you send your child to the school, the marginal cost is zero, right? You don't have to write a tuition check. And so it looks to be free, and since you're going to pay whether you use the school or not, most parents, unless they have some overwhelming reason, to find an alternative, will send their kids to the government school. And so the schools have a huge advantage. Talk about predatory pricing and unfair advantage. There's the government practicing what some people think the market is always filled with, right? Unfair price gouging and unfair competition. But here's the state doing it because it hampers private alternatives, because it taxes people already to use their schools. So there's no case whatsoever for the government being involved.
Yeah, and if it were just a babysitting process, that would be one thing. But as I pointed out to the audience, it's not a neutral process here. They actually cause affirmative damage to kids. I pointed out that every kid from the time he's 0 to 6 has this passion for learning and an awe of the universe, and he's bedeviling his parents with why. He's just curious about the world. And by the time he finishes with public schools at the age of 18, he hates to learn. His mind has been regimented. There's this deference to authority. I pointed out that public schooling is like Army Light. It's like going to boot camp for 12 years in a lighter form of regimentation, but it's still there. And so there's actual damage that's done to kids. And I pointed out that this is really just a system of socialism. You've got government central planners at a local level, state level, national level that is planning the educational decisions of thousands or millions of children. And so why wouldn't we expect there to be this chronic chaos and crisis? And I pointed out that even the president of the United States won't send his kids into public schools. So, the progressive says, oh, well, we need this minimal education and public schooling is vital to American society. And Dinesh won't ever come around to where we want. We just want a free market in education. So, it ends up, as you would expect, the conservative agreeing with the liberal, because, as I pointed out, conservatives love to preach the free market, but when it comes to the application of the principles where the rubber meets the road, they just can't walk the walk like we do.
Well, yeah, and going back to what you said about what the schools do to kids, we need to remember that the government schools were not some good faith effort simply to bring enlightenment to the world, the children of the country back in the before the mid 19th century, beginning in New England, Massachusetts, around 1840. So it starts fairly early, and then basically progresses through the country up into the progressive era at the turn of the 20th century. But it didn't have such a benign purpose. It wasn't just that they were incompetent at teaching reading and arithmetic. They had a purpose, and the purpose was, part of it was to shape what they regarded as the good citizen, but we can put some specifics on that. That wasn't just some vague thing about the good citizen. What they were training people for the factories, for the civil service, and for the armed forces. If you get right down to it, that's what they were grooming people for. And the school process was supposed to be, in the words of Joel Spring, who writes about this subject, a sorting machine. It was supposed to sort the kids out and kind of channel them into their appropriate bins. So the ones that were good at fighting, I guess the bullies and the people that got in fights in the schoolyard get channeled into the military, and then the ones that maybe they thought had a little more, I don't know what criteria they used exactly, but some were then groomed for civil service to take jobs in the government bureaucracies, and and then the rest basically for the factories. They weren't trying to train entrepreneurs. Let's put it that way. Not that you can train people in entrepreneurship, but that's not what they were aimed at. They were looking for docile people, good taxpayers, people who wouldn't rock the boat. And I can see where conservatives would think that's a good thing. I mean, occasionally they like to sound romantic and praise the rebel, but when it comes right down to it, they don't like rebels.
No, I said that's the problem with conservatism is that they want to conserve whatever exists. So if you've got a bad system, they're scared of change. They'll conserve the bad system. The other one is health care. What should be the role of government in health care? And not surprisingly, D'Souza gets up and talks about Obamacare. And Andre gets up and talks about the importance of people have a right to medical care. And I got up and I said, I said, Obamacare is not the problem here. And, this like conservatives do. They trim the weed instead of pulling out by its root. And I argue that there should be a total separation of healthcare in the state, total free market in healthcare, where Medicare is abolished, Medicaid is abolished, occupational licensure is abolished, all the economic regulations, the government regulations on healthcare, get rid of them all. That this is the secret of free market healthcare system to normally priced healthcare, not the chronic crises and chaos that goes on in this area.
Right. Pre-Obamacare, there was no free market in healthcare. Conservatives sometimes talk that way, but it was a system that constructed over, 100 years or so at both the state level, mainly at the state level, but more and more at the federal level, that rewarded powerful groups. Insurance companies in the states, every insurance company every state is a insurance regulatory fiefdom, where there's a close working partnership between the regulators and the insurance companies. Of course, the doctors have a protectionist guild through medical licensing and that control of the medical schools. And all that systematically was produced quite self-consciously. It was not a spontaneous order. It was quite unspontaneous. And that led to these powerful blocks, which left the patient basically at the mercy of either, some big organization, one or the other, either the government or hospital or insurance company. So you had a huge amount of third-party payment, whether government or insurance, which makes healthcare look cheap. It was artificially inflated in price, but then it looks cheaper to the patient because so many people have insurance through their employers, and therefore they overconsume. They don't need to be careful about what they consume because they just say, does the insurance cover that? And the costs, which eventually they pay, of course, are so hidden and disjointed that they don't see the direct connection between service and price. That's where you get cost consciousness, consumer consciousness, when you have an easy, visible link between cost and service. But if it's all shrouded and convoluted, something can appear free and you'll buy more of it than you ever would have bought. And so it was really sort of a corporate statist system. Conservatives like to claim it was the greatest system in the world. But Obamacare came along and just simply fortified it by making everybody buy insurance and we're subsidizing people if they fall below a certain income level, and then throwing in some bureaucracies to make it look like they would tame the worst abuses of this monster that had been set up over many, many years. That's what Obamacare gave us, and it's really a mistake to do what conservatives do, which is to look at Obamacare in a vacuum and then claim it's the greatest evil to befall the United States.
Yeah, because there's this sense of we can reform the system, that if we get rid of Obamacare we can do this or we can do that and we can do this. And as I pointed out, when you've got an inherently defective system, no matter what you do is going to make the situation worse. And then it's Ludwig von Mises, as I pointed out during the debate, that said that one intervention inevitably leads to new interventions to fix the problems with the previous intervention. And it's only us, we libertarians, who say, pull the whole thing out by the root, separate healthcare in the state, get rid of all government involvement in healthcare, and then all of a sudden now you're talking about a dynamic, normally priced, crisis-free enterprise that doesn't have government producing all these crises. Another area was immigration, which, if you can imagine, the sparks flew on this one, because this is one where conservatives and liberals agree. They may disagree on the margins or on the specific reforms, but I was there calling for the libertarian position on immigration, which of course is open borders, open immigration, free flows of people, free markets. And both D'Souza and Andre, the liberal, just went ballistic over this. They just can't even imagine doing such a thing. And despite the fact that conservatives, as I pointed out, talk about free markets and private property, and D'Souza brings up the national home thing, that we have a right to protect our national home. And to which I responded, yeah, this isn't Cuba. This is a country based on private homes, and that I have a right, a fundamental right, to invite anyone I want into my home or into my business and hire them with my money. But most important, Sheldon, I pointed out that this crisis has been going on consistently every day for my entire life, and that's because of immigration controls. It's central planning. And as long as people keep this system in place instead of a free market, just prepare yourself for perpetual crises, because no matter what reforms they happen to come up with, there's still going to be a crisis.
Right. Of course, we've talked about this at length, this issue. We talked about it last week, I believe. And so what you're going to hear from the other two, of course, highly predictable, right? The progressive's probably concerned about, well, he may be a little more friendly to immigrants. He'll be concerned about economic competition in the labor market and driving down wages of Americans. And the conservative will invoke sovereignty, like you say, Dinesh did, and perhaps terrorism and going on welfare. That tend to be their big three issues. So yeah, that's good. Good that the audience could hear the distinct the differences between those three positions. That was a real service.
Yeah, and then the fourth one was government role in the economy and monetary affairs. And this is where D'Souza and I actually piled on to Andre the Liberal. We both talked about the creation of wealth, and what produces wealth in a society, and that progressives just never give that a thought. They talk in terms of what are the causes of poverty, which, as I point out, is a ridiculous question, because poverty is the natural state of mankind. The real question is what causes wealth in a society? What brings about economic prosperity? And so when you have a libertarian type society where there's no income tax, there's no welfare state, there's no economic regulations, there's free enterprise, then you have this rising standard of living where even the people at the bottom of the economic ladder are benefiting. Even though there's disparities of wealth, everybody's better off because you have a growing society. And we talked about the importance of capital. And the problem is the progressives come along and they see all this wealth and say, oh, wow, what a bonanza here. I can confiscate this person's money and give it to another person and be good and caring. But in the process, they start this devolutionary process, and in which now there's going to be less wealth, less prosperity, and the society ultimately, if things go long enough, starts caving in on itself.
Right. Well, the progressive actually, if he was a little more up on economics and political economy, might have had something to contribute, because there are issues, and there are issues today of what I would call structural poverty. It's true that the question shouldn't be what's the source of wealth, source of poverty, because as you say, that's the natural condition. But we might ask what causes poverty to endure when we see wealth all around. So that's a fair question. And in a mixed economy, a corporatist economy, there is likely to be state-based exploitation. In other words, wealth being moved from one group to another, and not necessarily from the rich to the poor. If anything, it's more from the low income and middle up to the well-off. I mean, Adam Smith points out in The Wealth of Nations that where the government is making policy about masters and workers, it's much more likely to be asking the masters for counsel on what that policy should be. I don't think things have changed a whole lot. Sure, you could say organized labor has some input these days, but organized labor is not necessarily the interest of actual workers. Not all workers and even unions were crazy about the New Deal regime that came in with the Wagner Act. So there is structural and systemic exploitation going on. And I think many of the victims of that are working people. Now, you may say, well, their standard of living has been rising. Of course, I don't think it's been true since the big recession, the Great Recession. But even if it has been rising, if it would have risen more in a truly freed market, then that represents some form of exploitation. It's just not as visible because there's a general increase in wealth, which is certainly the case. But that means analyzing the system, and as I said, it's state-based. The most the most dangerous derivative, I like to say, is corporate power, because it's derived from the state. It's derived from state power. It's not something that can be conjured up in a truly free market.
Well, yeah, and unfortunately, nobody ever talked about monetary affairs. We didn't have enough time, but our position on that is pretty simple. Is Friedrich Hayek's notion of the denationalization of money, where you have the free market deciding the medium of exchange rather than this irredeemable fiat paper money system that plunders and loots people through an inflation. The other thing I pointed out is how liberals, progressives love to point at their big projects and say, look what we've done for you. But, in the words of Bastiat and Henry Hazlitt, as I point out to the audience, is that we've got to be looking at what is unseen, too. What about all the businesses that did not come into existence because people had their money taken from them to build this big, grandiose public housing project and so forth? And those, of course, are the unseen consequences. The fifth area, the final area, was foreign affairs. And as you can imagine, there was the sparks flew on that one, too. And really, I was surprised because, Andre, you would think the liberal would be talking about the importance of civil liberties and really concentrating on that. And that didn't come across. There was really this common notion between liberals and conservatives that you've got to have this huge force, which I called an imperialist force. They didn't agree that it was imperial. But all the death and destruction that this produces for American society. And along these lines, I know you wrote this fantastic article this last Friday on your TGIF article on FFF, our website. I highly recommend everybody to go read this. This is a fascinating thesis. In fact, I think maybe we might want to discuss that either next week or in some subsequent issue. Why don't you talk a little bit about what you talked about there, and then we'll maybe delve into it in more depth later.
Well, it was called the boomerang effect, how foreign policy affects domestic policy, and I was really reporting on a very good paper that's just been published in the Independent Review by Christopher Coyne, economist at George Mason University, and a PhD econ student at Mason by the name of Abby Hall. A very good paper. So I was really just quoting them and developing some of their ideas. I don't take any credit. It's something we've of course thought about, but they've systematically looked at how an interventionist foreign policy that includes occupation, trying to manage a foreign society, can eventually bring those measures home. I started off with it wasn't a quote, but a sentiment expressed by the late Chalmers Johnson, who said, if you don't get rid of the empire, eventually you'll live under it. And this is what he was getting at. You can't compartmentalize foreign and domestic policy. They're always intimately related. But Coyne and Hall show that it's more intimately related than maybe we even thought, that the skills that people learn in occupying and governing a foreign society, like when you have regime change and nation building and you need to repress insurgencies and keep a population under control, as happened in Iraq, as they try to do in Afghanistan, not much success, and even going back to the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century. Those skills and the equipment developed for doing those things find their way home, and that ends up affecting domestic policy, because you have people who are skilled in that sort of work who then are attempting to bring some of those skills to the domestic scene so that they can have jobs, change policy. It even affects the private sector, which then will contract with the government for services. And so they trace the surveillance state back to the Philippine occupation and the suppression of the Filipino revolt against the United States government in 1900 or so. They trace it way back to then. This is not Cold War. This NSA stuff, they say the roots are in the Philippine uprising, the suppression of the Philippine uprising. And as far as the military, they applied it also to the militarization of police, and they found the roots of that in World War II and Vietnam, where where they again took armed forces techniques and adapted them to domestic policing. Go into great detail, so I recommend that people go read the article.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thesis. I mean, you saw it somewhat after World War I, when the Great Depression hits. They say this is an enemy just like war, and they start mobilizing all these guys, and they bring military people into the administration, into the Franklin Roosevelt administration, and they start centralizing power as if they were really waging a war based on their experience of waging World War I. And yeah, that's a fascinating thesis, because you and I have both talked about how they produce the enemy overseas with their bombing and their interventions and their support of dictators and so forth. It engenders this anger that then manifests itself with terrorism, and then they use that threat of terrorism to take away our freedoms in the purported attempt to keep us safe from the enemies they produce. And that's the way I look at the NSA spying, is, oh, well, we're just keeping you safe by monitoring everything you're doing. But this thesis is an interesting twist on that. It sounds to me like it's saying that what they do in these countries, they inevitably becomes ingrained in how they look at life. So they come back here and they put those skills to work to take away our freedoms here at home, a more regimented society, more centrally controlled society. And as I said in this debate, I don't see a good end to this. I mean, the welfare warfare state is, I told the audience, is heading us toward national bankruptcy. This is something that I think liberals and conservatives don't pay much attention to, but we saw what happened with Greece. And we've got out of control debt, out of control spending, and they just look for new ways to spend money. I mean, this latest bombing situation in Iraq, where do they get the money for that? You know, they just raised the debt ceiling because they didn't have enough money to finance current expenditures. But all of a sudden, they've got plenty of money, and we know that they're just going to add to this mountain of debt. So this thing's not going to end well. But as I told the audience, Sheldon, you know, as long as people remain mired and fixed within this welfare warfare state paradigm, be prepared for perpetual crises, perpetual conflict, chaos, warnings, threats, danger, the whole thing. And that if they want instead a society based on peace and prosperity and harmony for them and their families, there's only one way out, and that's libertarianism.
Coyne and Hall make a deep point that I think is worth thinking about. They say that if there were no foreign policy component, so remember, the states have been practicing a non-interventionist foreign policy, people's the militarization of the police and a huge surveillance state. So if one day the bureaucrats woke up and said, well, why don't we militarize the police and let's start putting in NSA spying on everybody, they couldn't openly do that because, they figured that people wouldn't stand for it. And even a lot of members of Congress would raise a ruckus. Even today we have some, Ron Wyden and some others. So they couldn't get away with it. They just decided for domestic reasons they wanted to do it. But you can do it indirectly if you begin in a foreign country with a foreign policy of occupation and war and empire. Because then not only does it generate the scares, like you say, which makes it easier to install here, but it develops the human capital and the physical capital. So if there wasn't a foreign policy component, they say, over here nobody would be investing money in those things, in surveillance and the militarization of the police. It wouldn't seem to have a good return. But if you're going to invest the money to do it overseas, now it's just a matter of bringing it back here. So it's much cheaper, right? It's a lower cost strategy if you want to bring those things to the domestic society. And so that's what I think is one of the most important points they make in their paper. I definitely recommend that people look it up.
Yeah, that's fascinating because, as I saw what they were doing in Iraq, and they kept saying, this is freedom, this is freedom. And I kept saying, heaven forbid that they should ever import their concept of freedom back here to the United States. And it sounds like that's exactly what Chris Coyne is saying in this paper, is that they do import this concept of what they call freedom, which of course is the opposite of freedom. In any event, the debate's going to be posted online. I don't know exactly when, but you can Google the Freedom Library, great organization there in Yuma, and we'll be of course, linking to it in the FFF Daily. But it's something really good if the whole debate in terms of explaining to people the differences between liberals, conservatives, and libertarians, and highly educational. I'd highly recommend it. Anyway, that's our show for this week. We're out of time. I'm Jacob Hornberger, and this is Sheldon Richman. This is a Libertarian Angle, and we'll see you next time.